In 1942, on a jungle island most Americans could not find on a map, the United States Marine Corps learned how to disappear. On Guadalcanal, a raider or a scout sniper in the new mottled uniform could lie still in the undergrowth, and a man 50 meters away would look straight at him and see only jungle. 5 colors. Irregular shapes. The human outline dissolved into the green. In the campaign that turned the Pacific War around, the patient, hidden men held an edge the enemy could not see. A little over a year later, the same uniform landed on a strip of coral called Batio, and on that white sand, with the palms shot to splinters, the camouflage that had hidden men in the jungle did the opposite. It made them stand out. Dark shapes on a pale wall. The pattern built for the Pacific was, on this particular Pacific beach, working against the men who wore it. I keep coming back to that inversion. The same 5 colors. One island hid them, the next island gave them away. The pattern didn't change between Guadalcanal and Tarawa. The ground did. And the ground, it turns out, was the whole argument. This is the story of America's first combat camouflage, where it came from, why it worked in the jungle, and why, on the wrong beach, it failed the men it was built to protect. Here is the strange part, and it is the first thing that needs explaining. By 1942, armies had understood the basic idea of camouflage for decades. Hunters knew it. Painters knew it. The U.S. Army had even begun its own camouflage experiments back in 1940 and 41. And yet, 8 months into the war, it had nothing it was willing to issue. No combat camouflage uniform in the field. The experiments stayed experiments. Reports were filed. Nothing reached the men. Institutional inertia is not a dramatic enemy, but in this story, it is the first one. Then, in 1942, the problem stopped being theoretical. The demand from the Pacific was blunt. 150,000 uniforms in a working jungle camouflage. Now. The Army had no finished pattern to give. 150,000. That is not an experiment, that is a commitment, made by men who had no product to commit to. They needed the solution to already exist. It didn't. So someone reached into a file and pulled out a name that had no business being there. The answer to a military problem was about to come from a man who had never worn a uniform. Before we continue, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely makes a difference. All images in this video are from public archives, and the full list of research sources is in the description below. If you want to go deeper on this topic, I put together a detailed cluster on the Pacific Theater, link also in the description. Now, back to the story. The uniform reached the Marine Raiders in 1942. The Corps' Special Operations Troops, the men sent to do what ordinary infantry couldn't, and the scout snipers who lived in the jungle ahead of everyone else. They wore it on Guadalcanal, in the campaign that bled the Pacific War to its turning point. Its largest jungle test came a year later, on Bougainville, in the triple canopy of the Upper Solomons. In that terrain it was, by every account, extraordinary. 5 colors on the jungle face. Green, 2 browns, tan, black. Shapes that were organic, not geometric, varying slightly in scale across the garment, the way disruptive coloration works in nature. It doesn't hide the object, it breaks up the object's outline so the eye can't assemble it into a man. Up close you see spots. At 10 meters the spots merge. At 50, the outline is gone. A squad holding a line in heavy undergrowth became, from across a clearing, a fragment of the forest. For the patient, crouching, waiting war of the jungle, the ambush, the listening post, the sniper, it was exactly right. But read that sentence again, because it contains the flaw. Patient, crouching, waiting. Disruptive coloration breaks up an outline against the scene behind it. That works as long as the scene behind the man holds still. The instant he moves, the pattern moves with him, and a pattern traveling across a fixed background stops hiding the outline and starts drawing the eye to it. Marines noticed it themselves. A man in frogskin lying still could be remarkably hard to see. Once he moved, much of that advantage disappeared. This is the part almost no one mentions. The thing that made the frogskin brilliant, that it dissolved a still shape against a fixed backdrop, is the exact thing that betrayed it the moment the war asked the men to get up and run. The strength and the weakness were never two things. They were one thing, seen on two kinds of ground. It worked best for the men who had time to stand still. The Pacific was about to stop giving them time. So, who made the thing that made men disappear? His name was Norvell Gillespie. He had never served a day in uniform. He was a horticulturist, the gardening editor of a magazine called Better Homes and Gardens. When the demand for 150,000 jungle uniforms came down and the quartermaster had no engineered pattern to offer, his name came out of a file. A garden editor to hide an army. Hold that. America has been at war for 8 months. The Pacific is burning. And the man who solves the problem of concealing Marines in the jungle is someone who writes about flower beds. I find that almost unbearably good. What Gillespie understood, and what the engineers, with all their training, had struggled to formalize, was simple. A forest is not green. It is 20 greens, 3 browns, 4 yellows, light falling from above in fragments. He had spent his whole working life looking at exactly that. For the mechanism, he looked to the cryptic skin of a frog, irregular blotches at different scales that fool the eye at different distances. That was the jungle face. And then he did the genuinely clever thing. He gave the uniform a second face. 3 colors on the reverse: brown, tan, pale sand. For the beaches MacArthur's war would also be fought on. The garment turned inside out in seconds. 1 man, 2 terrains, 1 uniform. And it got a designation as dry as the man who made it was not. The Army filed the print as the M1942 reversible spot pattern. Spot for the rounded blotches Gillespie borrowed from the frog. It was printed on herringbone twill, HBT, the tough diagonal weave cotton that clothed the Pacific War. The Marine Corps cut it into utility uniforms that collectors and historians still catalog by year. The P-42 and the lightly revised P-44 that followed. The jungle side in 5 colors, the beach side in 3, reversible in the field. Frogskin came later, soldier's slang for the obvious reason. Duck hunter came later still, from the men who'd wear the surplus into the marshes after the war. On paper, in 1942, it was only ever the spot pattern. He had designed for 2 terrains. At Tarawa, the men would have time for only 1. November 20th, 1943. The 2nd Marine Division hits Baishio, a sliver of coral in the Gilberts, barely 2 miles long. Around 4,500 Japanese defenders dug into concrete and coconut log bunkers, and a reef too shallow for the landing boats. The boats grounded on the coral. Men climbed out into chest-deep water and waded hundreds of yards into machine gun fire with nowhere to hide. 76 hours of it. When Baishio was declared secure on the 23rd, more than 1,000 Marines dead, over 2,000 wounded, on 1 square mile of sand. And the frogskin, the jungle side, the 5-color face Gillespie drew from a frog's back, against white coral and shattered palms, did the opposite of what it was made to do. Green and brown on bone-white sand does not disappear. It announces. Now, I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets overstated. No camouflage pattern was going to solve Baishio. The reef, the tide, the bunkers, the open water under interlocking fire, Those killed men at Tarawa, not the color of their uniforms. The uniform is a small thread in a much larger catastrophe. But it is a revealing thread. The beachside existed for precisely this ground. Many Marines carried it. Yet you reverse a uniform in a quiet room before embarkation, not while you are waiting a reef under fire. Once the ramps dropped, which side faced out was the last thing on any man's mind. And here is what I keep returning to. Gillespie had anticipated the problem. The beach side existed for precisely this kind of terrain. What no designer can solve is the operational reality. The decision that would have mattered was made, or not made, hours earlier and 1,000 miles away, by men who never saw Batio. The pattern didn't fail at Tarawa. The plan for using it did. More than 1,000 men died on that coral. Some of them were wearing a camouflage built for a battlefield they weren't standing on. While Gillespie was printing 5 colors on cotton in California, the Japanese Imperial Army had reached an entirely different conclusion about how to make a soldier vanish. They didn't print anything. The American approach was industrial. Design it, print it, ship it, issue it to whoever needs it. The Japanese approach was decentralized and local. Each soldier carried a net and an instruction that amounted to, use what the island gives you. Leaves, grass, foliage, tied to helmet and body, and refreshed from the ground he was standing on. And then there was the smock, a garment with no Western equivalent, made from the shaggy reddish-brown fiber that grows at the base of coconut palms, the same material island fishermen had used for rain capes for generations. An organic ghillie suit, grown from the islands they were defending. U.S. Army intelligence photographed and circulated examples as early as 1942. There is one intelligence photograph of an American Marine wearing a captured Japanese sniper's outfit, climbing a coconut tree on Guadalcanal, a posed shot, meant to show the Japanese held no monopoly on the trick. There is something quietly remarkable in that picture. The most industrial military on Earth looked at a suit a fisherman made from palm fiber and said, plainly, that works. And it scaled past the uniform into a whole philosophy of defense. At Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the Japanese didn't just conceal themselves, they concealed the island. Caves, tunnels, pillboxes buried in coral, invisible until they fired. Before Peleliu, General Rupertus told his Marines it would be rough but fast. 3 days, maybe 2. It took more than 2 months. On Iwo Jima, 21,000 defenders waited inside more than 11 miles of tunnel. 36 days of fighting, nearly 7,000 Americans dead. I don't think the question is which approach was right. Each reveals the army that chose it. The Americans fought a war of production, solutions that could be copied and shipped by the 100,000. The Japanese fought a war of position, specific ground turned into killing zones no factory could outproduce. One army printed 5 colors on cloth. The other grew its camouflage from the trees. By January 1944, production of the spot pattern had stopped, but the design refused to die. And where it went next says as much as where it began. That summer, units including the 41st Armored Infantry of the 2nd Armored Division carried the camouflage into France. The story most often told is clean. It looked too much like the Waffen SS smocks. Friendly fire incidents followed, and it was pulled. The surviving evidence doesn't support that. The uniform was not withdrawn because of friendly fire. The documented reason is duller and more honest. The printing was cheap, the cloth faded and wore pale with hard use. Resupply was never set up for it. And the standard uniforms of the period were tied to as many friendly fire incidents or more. The friendly fire story survived because it is a better story than the truth. The truth is institutional. The Army had a working camouflage, tested for 2 years in the Pacific, and in the theater where the war would be decided, it barely used it. Not because of the Germans, but because the supply chain was never built for it. When the war ended, the Army sold the surplus, and American hunters found it almost at once. In forest and marsh, it worked as it had in the jungle. For decades, it lived on as duck hunter camo, so common that a generation of hunters knew it only as the pattern their fathers wore into the woods. A pattern designed to hide men from Japanese snipers in the Solomons spent the next 40 years hiding Americans from geese over Chesapeake Bay. Gillespie's frog, transplanted to the marshes of Maryland, the violence bleached out of it, only the usefulness left. But not all of its afterlife was gentle. The pattern was issued to France's foreign parachute regiments in the First Indochina War, and its design fed the French lizard camouflage that the paratroopers wore in the jungle toward Dien Bien Phu. A decade later, U.S. Special Forces issued Frogskin to the Montagnard fighters of Vietnam's highlands, and American SEALs and Rangers reached for it before Tiger Stripe became standard. The pattern kept turning up wherever men needed to vanish, and the supply system hadn't caught up. And on April 17, 1961, the CIA-trained Cuban exiles of Brigade 2506 waded ashore at the Bay of Pigs in the Frogskin pattern issued to them by the agency. 1,400 men, their air cover cut to a fraction of what was promised, abandoned within 3 days. The camouflage a garden editor drew from a frog ended on a Cuban beach, in one of the Cold War's defining failures. It outlived a world war, a covert disaster, and 40 years of duck season. In 2002, the Marine Corps adopted MARPAT, digital camouflage, built from pixels and field testing. The technology is unrecognizable next to a 1942 cotton print. The principle is identical. Break up the human outline with organic color variation at multiple scales. 60 years of trial and error, and the frog's skin rendered in pixels. What stays with me is not the cloth. It is that the answer came from a man who had never been a soldier, because he had spent his life looking, not at how to design a uniform, but at how nature solves the problem of being seen. At Tarawa, the pattern was wrong. Not stupidly wrong. Wrong the way any solution is wrong when the ground changes without warning. It worked in the jungle and failed on the coral. The Japanese, with no printed pattern and a fisherman's smock, had been practicing the lesson all along. The best camouflage is not a universal one. It is the one that fits the specific ground under your feet. We have been trying to make the soldier invisible for as long as we have made war, and we have never fully managed it. The frogskin was one attempt, by one man, looking at a frog in his garden. For a few years, on the right ground, it was enough. The frogs were there first. The men are gone. What remains is the logic of the decisions they made. If you'd like to go deeper into the Pacific War, I've put together a companion series that takes this story further. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching. If this is the kind of history you're looking for, subscribe. There's always another story waiting. The next documentary starts right after this one.